London is a poem by William Blake. William Blake was a romantic, but a different kind of romantic in many ways to Wordsworth or any other of his contemporaries. He combined poetry with artistry in his books. There's drawings around and paintings around his poems. It's a bit more complicated than that, but for the purpose of this poem, we don't really need to go into that. So William Blake was a believer in freedom and equality and democracy, much like other romantics, and was no big fan of kings and queens. And you can see this in this poem. He did actually love London earlier on, but one of the things that affected him was the French Revolution, and his belief that after the French Revolution, or perhaps it was true, there was a crackdown in London or in the UK as a whole in order to prevent there being a revolution here. So Blake was also a very deep religious man, but at the same time was a big critic of organized religion and was very concerned about the power that religious leaders had, and believed that they used this power in the wrong way and in a way that he didn't feel would have been done by Jesus. He believed that God was treated us all the same and believed the same thing about all of us. So he was a big critic of organized religion. And you'll see that in this poem. So as with all poems, you start with three things. First of all, I suppose four. You start with the title, think a bit about the narrative voice, and having read the poem, what do we know about the rhythm and the rhyme? And then what does that tell us about the meaning of the poem, thinking a bit about what we've learned having read it. So, the poem's called London, and I'm going to read it. London. I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So looking at the poem, we know it is a criticism of power. So it's one of the concerns is a concern about power and power used to regulate people and regulate how they act and behave. And what we see is a very regulated poem. So it has 4 lines in every stanza. It has what we call a quatrain. It has a very strong rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B, where the first line rhymes with the third and the second line rhymes with the fourth. Each rhymes at the end of the line. They're very strong rhymes. There's no forced rhyme or any rhyme that doesn't sound exactly right. There's also a very strong rhythm, although you won't necessarily see that immediately in the poem, but it is iambic tetrameter. And so within the poem, really strong rhythm, really strong rhyme, very regular. And so everything is very confined in this poem. So things are very confined and held together. And we'll see that immediately when we look at the words in the first stanza, which we'll get to in a moment. So, very confined poem. Everything's very organized and very regulated. And we can see that in the very regular rhythm and regular rhyme. So if we have a look at the poem, we can see, first of all, so having looked at the title, so we know the title, it's a poem about London, so it tells us about the city. And then obviously the narrative voice at the beginning, I, it's first person, so that makes it a very personal poem with a very personal experience of the person who the poem is about. So we have, I wander through each charted street. So right at the beginning, we can see from the poem, he's walking through the streets of London. And then the word charted is one of the first words we encounter. And actually this word is repeated. And you'll see there's a lot of repetition in this poem. And some of it's quite awkward, the repetition. And it just feels like things go on and never stop. So there's a lot of repetition. Charted means mapped or organized. And so the streets are very mapped. Everything is very regulated and organized for people in London. And then you've got this idea of the Thames being charted. And obviously we know that the Romantics were great lovers of nature. And here we see nature confined much like everything else. So charted, we've got regulated nature as well. In the same way as if you ever go to London or if you're from London, you'll see obviously the walls around London. Rivers aren't normally organized in that same way. They flow naturally. They're affected by the seasons, by the weather. But obviously the Thames isn't, because it has these walls around it that make sure that it sticks to the same shape all the time. And then we get to the word mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Again, you have this repetition, this awkward repetition that affects the internal rhythm of the poem. So although it's a very regulated poem with a very regulated rhyme, you do get the sense of things being a little bit awkward or not as strong internally as they're supposed to be, or as regular as they should be, or as regular as the people who are creating this would like it to be. So mark in the third line, mark, he means to see. And then in the next two uses of the words, he actually means something that is visible. So visible signs of weakness, visible signs of woe, sadness. And what's also interesting is he uses the word every. So that's a very important word. It's not just occasionally. He sees every person in the city that way. Everyone seems to feel this. And then that word every gets repeated over and over, particularly in the second stanza. So you've got in every, and we call this anaphora. And obviously, if you were writing this in an exam, you would not need to remember the word anaphora necessarily. You could say it was a repeated phrase at the beginning of the line. You just say it out. As long as you're mentioning the method, that's all that matters. And then you've got the word cry, in every cry, infants cry. And then the word in every again. And so this repetition again, lots of repetition. Again, this awkward repetition, creating an awkward rhythm, not as regular as you'd like it to be. The way the rhyme happens at the end of every line, it almost has a tuneful child's nursery rhyme feel to it, but the repetition just takes that away from it. So in every cry of every man, there's that word every again, in every infant's cry of fear, the word cry repeated, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles are here. Now the phrase mind-forged is extremely important here. And this is a very important idea for Blake, and it's probably the key image in the poem. And you can probably relate any idea you have really to this idea, the mind-forged manacles. It's almost something quite angry in the repetition of the M sound. So you hear the mind-forged manacles, and all those sounds, there's lots of sound words in the poem, cry, and their voice. You have the sound of the bells, the chimney sweeper's cry. Well, a lot of the bells aren't mentioned, just the feel of that possibly from the church. So you've got the tear, the harlot's curse. There's lots of sounds and things he hears. So a lot of it's to do with sound and hearing. But the mind-forged manacles is a really important theme. So if you were looking at this poem, what I would think would be a good idea would be to look up what a forge is. A forge is a place, certainly in the 19th century, they still exist, but in the 19th century where things are made. And largely you would have a blacksmith who would forge things to do with iron. And in that forge, they would have an anvil, they would put let's say, a horseshoe into extreme heat, and they would take that out, and then they would beat it with a hammer on the anvil to try and get it nicely shaped. And obviously a lot of people had horses in those days. So the idea of forges were quite common places, and they would make those horseshoes there as well, but they often made they would also make lots of other things with iron. So the idea that the manacles, which are handcuffs or chains, are forged in the mind is extremely important. So our chains, our feeling, our sense of being held is all in our brain. So we create the sense of being confined. So although he does look at the fact that there is regulation around people, we are held this way, there is also a sense that we create this in our own minds, and it doesn't have to be that way, that we can break those mind-forged manacles. Because if the manacles are formed in your brain, then there is a way out. You just have to break free of that and break free of that regulation. And that was a very romantic idea. Rousseau, remember I've talked about Rousseau before, but only if you saw the previous poem. Rousseau was a philosopher that many romantics believed in and followed, and was the basis of much of the French. His ideas are based. A lot of the French Revolution is based in his ideas, and one of the things he said was that everywhere man was in chains, and so this idea that we are confined and regulated by tyrannies, by kings and queens, by the power of others, is really important. So for Blake, the mind-forged manacles are in this cry of fear, the cry of every man, in all the voices of people talking, the bands, the things that stop us from doing stuff. That's all in our brain. And he sees it in the faces, he sees marks of weakness, and all of this comes back to the mind-forged manacles. And then he goes on to talk about some things he sees, and he talks about some of the lowest people in society really in the 19th century. So we have people such as chimney sweeps, we have soldiers, we have harlots, people who are on the lowest rungs of society, earn the least, are the working class, who are used to do people's dirty work, and which often leads to their own destruction or hurt in some way. So these people, the people mentioned, are very important because they are people that are used by society and exploited by those in power. So you've got the chimney sweepers' cry. The chimney sweepers were the people that cleaned the chimneys. And then obviously straight away you've got every blackening church of Paul's. Blackening from quite literally the pollution in London from the smoke, but also blackening the idea of sin, illness, the fact that the churches themselves are becoming disgusting places. Remember, he didn't like organized religion as opposed to organized religion. And then churches themselves are not doing the right thing. They're not helping these chimney sweepers. They themselves are part of this regulated society that exploits and keeps people in their place. And then you've got the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So there, the blood was a reference to things like the putting down of protest. Quite literally, people were shot. Palace is a representation of the king, or the queen in those days. So runs in blood down palace walls, sense of tyranny, people being killed for protesting, which obviously was actually happening. So the soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most, in the next line, so this is the thing he sees the most through midnight streets are here. So now perhaps it's nighttime, or maybe he's been walking all the way through the night. Through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse. So the prostitutes are young, talking about the exploitation of the young, and I suppose the notion of abuse, of power again, because those prostitutes are being used by rich people, by people who are supposed to be virtuous, and there you have a connection with things like Jekyll and Hyde, like Inspector Calls, where the virtuous, the moral of society themselves are the people using those who are in need. And then you've got the curse. I suppose that's just really a swear word, or it could be a curse that she is putting on people. Blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So I suppose the prostitute, possibly infecting people with diseases, but also just the notion of the way society is destroying these important institutions like marriage, and these are being destroyed by this new society. And the hearse is kind of oxymoron of some sort, not really, but it is a kind of oxymoron. The idea of a wedding and a funeral. A wedding should really be a time of joy and celebration, and also the possibility of birth, and then a hearse is a funeral, obviously when someone has died. So you've got those two contradictory terms. So really a poem about power, one of the power poems really, a criticism of those in power, a criticism of exploitation and abuse of power, and the way in which regulation is keeping people down and creating these mind-forged manacles.